Hello, I'm Jim Schmidt, and welcome to Continental Leadership Roundtables. I'm here with some great lifelong friends. First on my left is Monty Kelso, president of the Slingshot Group. Next to him, Scott Rummel, voice actor in movies and television. You hear him all the time. Bob Feller, full professor, head of winds and percussion here at BIOLA University. And on my right, Danette Farrow is an entrepreneur and producer. And the title that applies to all of us here at the table is former Continental. Or Continentals for life, as we like to say. So I'm the president of the Continentals Global Foundation, and we're here to talk about not just the past, but talk about the future. I want to start a little bit with your individual Continental experience. There's one here at the table who has a distinction that none of us have. And that, sorry, I'm not saying you're old. I'm just saying you were at the beginning with Cam. Talk about that a little bit and your experience.
The first time I ever saw the Continentals was in my church in Colorado, in Denver. And boy, I was 13, sat on the front row, cried the whole time. I wanted to be in that group so bad. And I kept thinking, I'm in Denver, how can I be in that group there in Oregon? I was 15. My dad took a job in Portland, Oregon. Go figure. So I had been in Youth for Christ for quite a while with one of Cam's friends. He suggested that I just go right up to Cam and tell him that I wanted to be in his group. Well, I'm not shy, so of course I did that. And I got my interview and my audition in about 20 seconds, and that was it. You know, it was like, this is great. I'm here. You need me. I need you. We're fine. And it's been that way ever since. So that was my original contact with Cam, was just, audition her. She's fine. It's not that way anymore. You know, there were like 15 of us, and now there's thousands and thousands.
And that group we affectionately call the Originals, right?
Correct.
That was 1964, correct?
I think the Originals are the ones that went to Youth for Christ performances and Youth for Christ Winona Lake for all the competitions. And then in 1965, that group right there, 63, 64, 65, are really the Originals. Then in 67 is when Continentals first started.
So that's when Cam and Ralph Carmichael signed the original papers for the Continental Singers Ministry to start officially in 67.
Right.
So that's why we celebrate this year just our 50th year officially.
Yes.
But there's really a few years at the front end of that. So
thank you for pointing that out.
We're grateful for the Originals. The Originals still get together, actually, and sing together and meet together, and it's really cool. Some lifelong relationships there. So then how many tours did you do?
I did from 65, then 67, 8, 9, and 70. And then I was with New Hope Singers after I left Continentals.
Okay.
Okay.
So what you guys have in common. So what was your experience, your Continental experience?
Yeah, I was the country boy from Indiana who was going to a Bible college in Joplin, Missouri called Ozark. And this group came through called Jeremiah People. And, I mean, it was one of the best things I'd ever seen. I was blown away. And they were doing auditions for Continental Singers. I knew nothing about them. I'd never seen them. I'd never heard of them. I did audition, not knowing why. Had no intention of going with Continentals, but as God would have it, He directed me right in there in 1976. And Rex Kinnemer was my first Continental director. Great experience. I thought, okay, done that. That's awesome. I saw the world and, had a great experience as a singer, and went back to my Bible college a few days late because the tour went longer. I was there for 2 days in crisis. I had a culture clash that happened as a result of the Continental experience. I left after about a week thinking, this isn't for me. I went back to Indiana, got into my family business, and within a few months, spring rolled around, and I began to just smell the fumes of the bus, and I literally was the last guy to knock on the door of Continental, saying, I'm kind of late to the party, but is there a room on any of the tours? And this was 77, and there was one male spot on Tour C with Dennis Kern going to the Caribbean. And that was the tour that changed everything. I met my wife, and that's where I think God got my heart fully in understanding what the power of the gospel is through music. I mean, it changed everything. And, you know, just the story goes, began to just continue to show up, and all of a sudden I was a director, and just the experience of my life. I consider my years with Continentals the best education and the best season of my life. And I paid a lot of money to go to school too, but what I learned most, that I apply the most today, started as a leader with Continentals.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, you guys had some overlap with New Hope, is that right?
We sure did.
Talk about that and your tour experience.
It must have been the spring of '77. I'd had a friend that had traveled or had been a part of the Disneyland All-American College Marching Band back in Florida. And I thought, well, that's what I wanted to do. So I auditioned thinking that this is a done deal. This is what I'm doing for the summer of '77. Auditioned, I don't know how well it went, but it wasn't enough to get in. And so my dad made a quick phone call to Continentals because my brother had traveled a couple years before that, and said, do you have any need for a trumpet player? And Johnny Johnson said, well, we've got 2 tours. We've got one here and we got one there. So my dad came back and said, would you be interested in traveling with Continentals? And I said, sure. So my first tour experience was Tour I in '77 with Ken Wagoner. And then I went back again in, that's when I met Monty, the fall after that. I was supposed to go back to school, spent 2 weeks in school, got a phone call from Ken Wagoner saying, hey, we're putting 2 trumpets together with this group called New Hope. It went from the New Hope Singers and just plain old New Hope. And if you decide to go, we will add trumpets. If you don't, we will never have brass with this group ever again. So I dropped out of school and went on the road for a year with New Hope after a summer with Continentals. And then the following year, I took a summer off. That was the summer of '78, because we had been on the road for 12 months already. The following year, went back, and I was an assistant director with Larry Sparks in the orchestra. And the year after that was an assistant with Al Streeter, and then directed 81, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 87.
Most of those were Continental brass groups, right? And fantastic groups they were, actually.
Yeah, it's
really amazing.
And those 2 trumpets made all the difference in New Hope. All of a sudden, New Hope took a little bit of a jazz turn that year, and I think musically, it was probably one of the best years of New Hope, and the last one.
It was.
I guess we buried them, didn't we?
There's lots of tour overlap here, too, because you guys have toured together. What's your Continental experience?
We grew up in a church that had Continentals, every year, and it was such an amazing concert every time, and my mom and dad were actually married on a singing tour. So it was kind of in our blood, music, but also the whole touring idea. And we had a group at our church that was a choral group called Life Society that Jim and I were in. When I was 17, which was 78, I think, I kind of was making some bad choices and going sideways a little bit, as 17-year-olds can do. And Jim was going on tour that year and encouraged me to go to Christian Music Camp, which was sponsored by Continental Singers. And I went up there, and it was just such a wonderful time up there. Like you said, the Jeremiah people were there, and all these different folks, and great, wonderful music, and really a spiritual element that made me really rededicate my life to Christ. And I came back from that camp, kind of a different person, and really just started talking to Jim about how his Continental trip was and stuff, and we kind of figured that maybe we could go together. And so I auditioned and sang Amazing Grace, like so many do. I was accepted, and Jim and I actually got into the same tour. Jim and I had been singing together since we were in 2nd grade at church. That particular tour I call the Amazing Race, because we did 10 states in 10 days to New York, and I'd never been out of California before. So here I am going across the country in 10 days. Then we got to New York, and my first plane flight ever was New York to Paris on a TWA 747. And at that time, everybody was smoking on the way to Paris, and it was just, it was a crazy experience. But we did 2,500 land miles that year. I saw such a different world and saw the people that were hungry for Christ. And I came back a different person. I came back with a different kind of confidence that God supplied, that it wasn't my own confidence, but seeing the things that had happened on that tour really changed me and gave me the true knowledge that God's in control, that He is, watching over us. And so there was a boldness in my faith, and I loved it so much, and we had such a fun time. It was a tough time because it was so much travel, and I'll never forget. In Paris, something was happening to me in Paris where I couldn't keep my eyes open, and I was falling over, and it was like, what is going on? It was my first jet lag experience, and I thought something was wrong with me, but it was, at moments it was tough, but it was incredibly rewarding. And so then the next year, I wanted to go again. I joined the Fall Continentals, which was a group that basically rehearsed and then did concerts around Southern California. It was led by Jeff Kennedy. And during that time, Jeff asked me if I would go on the Hawaii trip. I thought that would be awesome, and it was awesome. It was a great trip. We had two shows. We had a secular show that we did in hotels and cruise ships and stuff, and then we would invite people to our Christian shows. And we actually saw a ton of people come to Christ. It was a very fun tour. And then I was kind of like you, done with that, we're done. And my girlfriend, who's now my wife of 35 years, she was going on tour in 1981. And I was really dreading that she was going to be gone for so long and stuff. And I was basically cooking at a restaurant during the summer, and I think you called me.
I did.
Was it you that called me?
I did. I wanted you.
Yeah, that's right. So Monty called me and said, hey, we have a spot. And so I thought, well, you know what? Terry's gone for the summer, and that's going to be good. And we were going down to the Caribbean. And so we did my last tour, 1981, with Monty and Krista. And, every tour was different. Every tour taught me something different. Every tour was a different experience, but definitely changed my life. I mean, Continentals really did. You talk about the ripple effect, and I see the ripple effect going from Continentals into different ministries I've been involved with and my career, and so it's been awesome.
That tour that we did in '79 was really pivotal for me, but leading up to it, my first exposure to the Continentals, I think it was 1970 at the Valley Music Center in the San Fernando Valley, and I think there were maybe 5 groups on the platform altogether, and my world changed. I'd never seen anything like it. And then the Continentals came every year after that to our church, and one year I auditioned after the concert, just like Scotty did, for Jim Chafee, who's now one of my dearest friends. He was the assistant director for Johnny Johnson, and then Jim auditioned me. And then I also went to the first Christian music camp the year prior to the one you're referring to, and had a little solo there, and that was my first opportunity to meet Cam. And he said, are you going on tour next year? And I said, well, I'd like to. He said, you should. So I did. I went on tour the South Pacific with Brad Holmes, phenomenal director, and Brad's renowned in the choral world back east, and a great experience. But then in the fall of '78, I went to a Jeremiah People concert in Long Beach. It might have been your home church, actually.
For some people that don't know who Jeremiah People is, describe this group. It was kind of an
Music,
outlier style of group, but
music,
brilliant.
comedy, drama, satire, incredible quality. So many talented people that came out of that. Jim Custer is one that
And
many
Chuck
people,
Bolte.
and Chuck Bolte, who started it early on, incredible. So I went to a Jeremiah People concert, and Cam was there, so I went up to say hi. And he said, no, tell me your name again. And I told him my name, and he said, you went on tour? And I said, yeah, I did, and it was great. And, are you going again? I said, yeah, I am. I'm going next summer. I'm going to Great Britain. He said, oh, that's good. He said, well, let me ask you something. I'm 17 at this point. He says, would you ever consider being an executive with the Continental organization someday?
At 17.
Sure. You know, I mean, it was like, what do you say to that? You're
Only
17.
Cam.
Only Cam.
Yeah.
And I said, well, yeah. And he said, well, in that case, I think you should tour with Fred Human to Europe next summer. I said, okay. I called the office the next day, got on Fred's tour. Scott was on that tour with me, and literally.
You had asked me if I'd ever considered being an executive with Continentals. So I said, yeah, let's go. That's the ripple effect.
But yeah, seeing the potential in people is one of Cam's great gifts, and to see that duplicated in other leaders like us and others who've inspired others, hopefully, that's an incredible thing. That's definitely part of the ripple effect. But
I think that's part of the secret of Continentals was Cam's ability to recognize emerging talent and emerging leaders and call it out. I mean, even before we even knew we were leaders, he would call it out. At 17, we're still discovering ourselves, right?
Yeah. And I became a vice president and was involved in helping to choose the directors. And as you guys know, Bob and Monty have both been directors. The directors came from different backgrounds. You know, some guys had a long pedigree of, you know, in academia and degrees in choral conducting or this or that.
That would not be me.
Nor me. And other guys were like me and Monty that were, you know, musicians.
Then
and
there
so
was
forth.
Bob,
and
who became that.
And then everything in between, who went on to be, you know, really solid and some great directors. But the thing I learned from Cam, the bottom line issue, the question to answer is, will anybody follow this person?
Yeah.
And that really overrides all that, because some of our best were at both ends of the spectrum, you know. And so that's a great lesson that I've applied many times, is will anybody follow this person?
He said when he was directing tours, he always knew that there was somebody on the tour that was better than he was musically. There was always somebody on the tour that was more spiritual than he was. There was always someone on the tour that was better at this or that or the other thing. But he said there was nobody on that tour that could put enough of all of those things together, get him on the bus, and take the bus down the road. And that's leadership. That's what you're talking about. That's that leadership quality. And maybe you can use those people that are stronger than you are. And I agree 100%. In 1981, Paul Boyd was slated to take the tour to Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji. And I think Paul was called away, and so I must have been the next guy in line. And so Cam called and offered a tour. I accepted, and he shortly thereafter invited me up to his house in Thousand Oaks, and he said, let's fix spaghetti dinner. And so I went up there and we had dinner together, and then we sat in the jacuzzi. And I remember Cam sort of exhorting me, knowing that, as you kind of joked about, that pedigree of education and academia, and saying, don't be like one of the other directors in the 60s, and you can ask him about this in the second panel discussion. But Daryl left camp with one piece prepared perfectly. And the rest of the program wasn't quite up to snuff. So Cam sort of exhorted me and said, don't rehearse one piece. But he must have seen something that, as you had sort of suggested too, Monty, and that is some sort of leadership that I would have never seen myself. And I look back and think, I can't believe that Cam took a risk on a young kid like me, because I would have never felt that I was qualified. When I look at guys like you, Monty, and those guys that were directing those days, I thought, I don't measure up anywhere close to these guys. But Cam must have seen enough of something to make a phone call and offer a tour, and that one phone call literally changed my life.
One of the things I know about you, Bob, is that you had a confidence about you, whether you felt it deep inside or not. You had a confidence about you that gave people the assurance that they could follow you. And I remember on our tours, you had this humble confidence that, I mean, what better quality for a leader than humility and confidence? And I've just always admired that about you.
What other directors did you tour with besides Cam?
Ken Wagner. Let's see, Steve Hilson, and then Willie Renzema, and Cam. Cam was the consistent thing for me, I think, over the whole gambit. But when I was in the different groups and had different leaders, they all were Cam. Does that make sense? They all had that
little DNA or something.
Yeah, I don't know what it was. It was the way he directed and the way he spoke. And so we were just becoming these clone type people that were doing the things that we were supposed to do, but it was consistent. It never stopped. It never changed. We grew, obviously we grew in maturity and our spiritual wisdom and stuff, but the whole feeling was, if you were in a Continental group, you knew that down the road there was another Continental group that was performing the same things that you were performing, and we could all be on stage together, 5-10 groups doing the same thing, and it looked exactly the same, and the directors were exactly the same, and we knew what we were doing. I think that was probably the best part. We all had a confidence that we were doing what we were supposed to be doing.
Let's talk about that for a second. When we started the Continentals Global Foundation in 2013, I think it was, after the U.S.-based ministry had completed its mission and wasn't sending out groups anymore, but yet we had all these internationally based groups. We got together as a board, and full disclosure, Monty and Danette are both involved on the board, which I'm really grateful for. But I spent a lot of time trying to distill down what it is that does that. Like, what is it that makes a group, an effort, a project, a continental project? And for me, we can debate this, but for me it boiled down to 4 things really that I see as the pillars of what is continental, and that is vision, a unique vision for the world, leadership, excellence, a commitment to excellence, and impact on the hearer, and certainly impact on us as participants, but really the goal of every program, it was never about show, it was always about impact. So vision, leadership, excellence, and impact. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I think excellence is one of those words that the church is kind of, it's affected us adversely more than positively, because everybody's, in the 90s had excellence as part of their value system, and it was like, well, what's excellent? It's, it's giving your best stuff, I guess. But there was something about Continentals that stood out, and it was an opportunity for ordinary people to step into a professional environment with just a little bit of talent, and then some, but a commitment. And I think it was that sense of excellence, that value of excellence, that caused the Continentals to come out of the woodwork, people coming from all different backgrounds, and now globally all over the world, to step into something that they would never create on their own. It was like fast forward into an opportunity to be a part of something truly remarkable. And that changes people's lives. It does change people's lives. So that's my thoughts on excellence. The impact is kind of the result of that.
There's 65,000+ people out there that are Continentals, and you become a Continental, and you're a Continental for your entire life. You can't take it away. There's something in there that is it's so complete and so full and so moving that you don't ever want to let it go. There's groups that you visit or hear, or I still yellow pad everything, right? I go to church, I yellow pad, because that's what we learned, was how to be better tomorrow, how to be better next year, when you go on tour again, what do you want to do to change it? And I think the biggest part of that is that we're always looking for that next best thing that we can fix or do or become. And it is a way of life for us. It's a way of life for me, and I haven't sung in a group for years. But, oh well, that there's other things that I do because of it. And I think all of us are in the position of doing other things because of our original start with Continentals. I look at when we were first doing the Continental Singers, when there was only one group. You are in a big church, and the next day you're in this teeny tiny little church, and then we went to a different group. We became a New Hope Singer, and we did colleges and universities and things, and then we went to church that night, and those were little churches or big universities or whatever. And all the experiences that we had made that Continental singer in us grow again and grow again, and the different directors grow again.
Right.
You know, everybody had the same willingness and the same desire to make it perfect.
Yeah.
So,
I've got the excellence and the impact. What else did you say?
Vision, leadership, excellence, and impact.
Okay, vision, leadership.
They're
So
all
on the
part.
excellence thing, it's interesting because when we got on tour in 1979 with Fred Heumann, we really began to understand what excellence meant. Because look, we're going to be excellent. Our music's going to be excellent. The way we look's going to be excellent. And it was really that difference that you were talking about. That, you know, this was not a church choral group. This was really a professional group. So I really learned about excellence because I'd never had somebody that was a leader or a director that was so committed to musical excellence and performance excellence and spiritual excellence. And, you know, just, it was really a whole kind of new thing. It was just like having a great coach, you know, like, and so that was part of the change there. And the impact is really interesting to me because there is the impact on the Continental, which we're kind of talking about now. But we can't forget, and you know, that first year that we toured, there was 14 groups, I think. And I just picture all of these buses going across the United States in all different cities. And every place the Continentals went, lives were changed. I mean, it was, we can't forget that what we did was, you know, sing about Jesus and offer people a chance to accept him, and then in our off time, boldly sharing our faith in different countries, not tied to anything but meeting somebody on a street or in a neighborhood. And so I really think that there's this two-sided impact. The Continental is impacted. They are growing in incredible ways, becoming excellent. And then the impact of the ministry, you know, I mean, just on our tour, we saw so many people come to Christ across Europe and the United States, and it's really a beautiful experience where a young person can join this and be impacted to become a leader, but also to impact those that we are singing to and talking to in host homes. And so it's really a win-win. It's really a beautiful thing when lives are changed like that.
Yeah. You always had astoundingly good groups. You're incredibly skilled as a leader and as a musician, one of the greatest trumpet players I've ever heard. And your groups were big, your brass groups. And I imagine you pulled up to some pretty tiny places that maybe were empty at concert time. So as a leader, what'd you tell your team?
The group might be very, very strong musically and maybe not quite so strong spiritually. And the next year it might be just the opposite, where this group might not have been so great spiritually, but they were musically on fire. And so how do you manage that? And you know, your efforts are going to gravitate towards, this is the weaker area, this is what we have to give more attention to shore this up.
Right.
And if they're great musically, all right, let that coast, but let's really focus on what we need to do to beefing them up spiritually. But pulling up to a small church, you know, at that point you just say, it doesn't matter whether there's 5, 50, or 500. You know, God is in the pews, and we're going to offer him our very best tonight. Doesn't matter who is there. We have to do our very best. It's our spiritual service of worship to do that and give him the absolute very best.
Our tagline for many years was Continental Singers, the experience of a lifetime. And for me, I kind of invert that. For me, it was a lifetime of experience in terms of the things that I learned. And I already mentioned Scotty being a voice actor. And Scott, you mentioned something to me years ago about your discipline and your regimen as you approached your voiceover career and how you treated it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
When I was pursuing my voiceover career, part of the things that I would do is I kind of had this just don't give up mentality, which I know was influenced by my time with Continentals. And like, I would have to drive from Orange County to Hollywood to do auditions for free, you know, and drive back. And, You know, in the beginning I was praying for 1 audition a week, then I was praying for 2 auditions a week, and then 1 audition a day, and then 1 job a week. And so that was the progression. But, you know, people would say to me, you drive all the way up there and they don't pay you? And I said, yeah. And why do you do that? Well, that's because that's part of this journey, you know?
People would ask, what do you do for a living? And you say,
I audition for a living. And if I get paid, that's just the icing on the cake. And I had to have that mentality to begin that career. I used to read every billboard out loud on the way to LA from Orange County to practice and warm up. I used to be in a workshop at least once a week, probably twice a week, which meant I was driving to LA, coming home, having dinner, and then driving back to LA. You just kind of have this thing that, you know, Continentals teaches you do whatever it takes, right? You have to have that mentality. And I saw a lot of people that kind of fell by the wayside because they just didn't want to keep that thing going. And a lot of it, again, is trusting in God, that He has a plan and that He's guiding your plan. And if you just keep moving, He's going to open doors and He's going to do those things. And those are things we saw in Continentals, you know. I loved to tell this story about how when we were on our 79 tour and we were doing so many concerts, and we had been on the bus, had been in Yugoslavia, and then we were driving to Austria, I think, and something went wrong, and we did not have a place to stay, and we did not have anything to eat. We were hungry. We had been on the bus for 24 hours. We were tired, and we had this great road manager with us in Europe named Case Clausen, and he was such an awesome spiritual guy. He was one of Brother Andrew's guys that smuggled Bibles and did all that stuff. I'll never forget, we were on the bus and we were looking at this lighted phone booth, and he was in the yellow pages, just going through the yellow pages. And you would see him answer, and we'd all be watching him, and then he'd go like this and hang up and then keep looking. And we were all so hungry and everything. And just looking for a place for us to sleep and grab a meal. So he comes back on the bus and he goes, I know God has a great place for us. And I'm going to pray with you right now. We're going to believe that God has a place for us. So let's pray together. And he prayed this amazing, strong, confident prayer. And then he went back out there, and we could all see him on the phone, and he was like, yeah, you know, and you could tell he was happy, and it was like, what is going on? And there was a castle in the Alps near where we were. And they had been expecting a tour group of exactly the same amount of people as our Continental group. So they already had the meal prepared, and we stayed in this beautiful castle. We stayed in these rooms with these beds that looked like they were made for kings, and they had entertainment for us that night. And it was so interesting because for me, that was such a faith-strengthening moment, saying, you know, that we were destitute, no food, nothing. And for, I don't know how many people we had, I think it was 33, but that was the number of people that canceled. It was the exact same number. It wasn't one off. And it was like God had been preparing that moment for us, that beautiful respite and amazing meal, probably for a long time, you know, I mean, because this tour group that canceled had been planning it and whatever and couldn't make it that night, and they treated us wonderfully that night, and it was an amazing gift from God. Anyway, I guess that just showed me that if you don't give up, if you really trust in God, and if you keep going, there's blessing and there's reward and there's God there. Sometimes I just think He wants to see us working hard towards something and seeing that we really want it, and then He opens those doors. And that's what all those things get instilled. When you see stuff like that, that's the confidence I was talking about earlier. It instills a confidence that comes from God that says, you know, you keep going. I'm right there with you. I'm clearing the pathway before you. And so anyway.
Over the years, we've been in some pretty remarkable ministry situations that weren't planned. And I know you had some experiences in Asia. Talk about that a little bit.
Oh, yes. We were a young group, okay? A young group of people anyway. So this was during the Vietnam crisis. And our job was to go to some of these bases and minister to these guys who the next day were going out on a flight and dropping bombs. And but these bases were just sort of in the middle of nowhere, right? And we came as a big group, and there's 30 or 40 of us, with instruments and sound equipment, and light equipment, and all this stuff. And here we are in a little cafeteria area performing, or a little chapel.
And what country is this?
This would have been part of them would have been in the U.S. proper, like a U.S. base, and we would have been in Asia somewhere. So one of them was, I believe, was Cebu and all of these kind of places. So we're at an Air Force base, and the general, I do remember him, his name was General Black, came up to us and he said, listen, he says, I want you to do your performance tonight here. We're going to have you a nice dinner, and then you do your performance. And then in the morning, we're going to take you out onto the tarmac. And so you'll get to see these guys taking off in their big bombers. And he said, just remember that when you get out there, you give them the old thumbs up, and you encourage them, because out of 10, maybe 8 won't come back. Maybe 8 will. Wow. But if you stop and think about it, those guys heard you tonight, and you're going to send them off tomorrow. So we did that. And standing there watching them, and these cockpits are open, and their thumbs up, and getting ready to go do their jobs. And we had done our job for the night. It was very moving, standing there watching them, thinking, today you may be with Jesus in eternity. Today you may come back, but we won't ever know, because we weren't there. So that night we were supposed to go to a different base. And General Black came in and he said, I'm sorry, you can't go to Friendship Base. You've got to stay here. He said, we've got some murmurings going on. We just want you to be safe. We woke up the next morning, the entire base, Friendship Base, was gone. It had been bombed in the night, and it was gone.
Wow.
And so we recognized very quickly that we were in enemy territory. We were being protected. We had a job to do.
What are some of the most unique concert experiences that you have and that you remember?
We were in Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica, which was not a tourist location. It was very much a place in turmoil, political unrest, rioting. It was a tough place to see as a kid, because we saw the poorest of the poor, and that was eye-opening in that way. But we didn't have a bus. We had a flatbed sugarcane truck. And there was goo on the bottom, and that's what we had to travel with. And they had warned us that we were going to travel across the country, and it was a really long trip. Do you remember that trip? And they had to have a tarp for us to put over us, because we were going to go through a town that if they saw any white people, they would attack us. They would throw rocks and try to get us. And so it was tense, right? So we did this, and we drove all the way, and there was this little church, and we began to set up in the church. And do you remember there was a ton of people outside the church? Do you remember this time I'm talking about?
Yes.
So we started setting up in the church, and I remember you were bewildered because you were wondering why all the people were standing outside. The people were standing outside because they couldn't afford the ticket price. And I remember you were just not having any of that. And so I think you told us basically to tear down, and then we went outside and did a little concert. We did a few songs for the people that were outside, and just to see the joy on their faces. And then it had gotten dark, and then we had to get back in the sugarcane truck. And then when we approached this town, we had to put the tarp back over us. And I always wonder about things like that. Like, was there one or two people that were there that were so moved that it really just changed their lives. And that's the thing, we just never know until we meet together in heaven. But that was a very memorable, of course, you know, the big fun concerts in Rotterdam at the Doelen for many people, those were amazing, but just the little small ones where they were very impactful.
What took place in those 80 days in tour is probably about 10 years in real life. And there were so many experiences that took place, but there was one experience that really sort of sticks out in my mind as one of the most, if not the most memorable Continental experience I ever had. We were going into Erfurt, East Germany, and this is when it was behind the Iron Curtain. It still was East Germany as we knew it then. And we came to the border crossing, and supposedly an East German tour guide was supposed to meet us at the border. And our Dutch tour bus drivers said, we don't know what we're going to do with this guy because we want to think of a way to ditch him so that we can do a concert that night because it's illegal for us to do these concerts. And so we pulled up, and I remember all of us putting our passports in a shoebox and handing them over to the East German border guards. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is our lifeblood. These are our passports. We have no idea what's going to happen. Our Dutch bus drivers disappeared along with the East German border guards, and then a East German border guard shows up, and he's got this machine gun across his chest, and he's standing like this, and he starts poking around the bus. And I had 3 years of German in high school, and at that time I thought, oh, I should have paid attention more. I should have paid attention more, you know. And so finally he asks to open up the bins of the bus, and so I open up the bins, and was ist das? What is this? And I said, it's a saxophone. And he asked if we were a musical group, and I said, no, we're a bunch of Americans touring cathedrals, the beautiful cathedrals in East Germany. He kept poking around, and we had a bunch of tents that had been brought by our Dutch bus drivers. So we eventually made it through the border crossing, and we went to what we would consider like a KOA campground. And we had to pitch these tents because it was under the false premise that we were American students that were there to check out all these beautiful cathedrals in East Germany. So here we are, a bunch of Americans trying to read Dutch instructions on how to put together tents. And there were poles missing, and there was this missing, and there were tent stakes missing. And it was actually very comical how we put these tents together. And we have some actually just very funny pictures of our Continentals trying to put these tents up. And when they were all done, we all piled back in the bus, and we took off, and we actually did. We went and we saw several of these beautiful cathedrals. And then we were told, this is where you're going to sing tonight. Turns out that the East German tour guide never showed up at the border. So we were on our own, which was just a blessing from God. And so we started touring all these different cathedrals. And then we changed clothes, we set up, and we did a concert in this gigantic Catholic cathedral. And we shared part of the concert with a Czechoslovakian choir. After the concert, we went across the street, and there was this gigantic meal that had been laid out for us. And so we all sat down, and I remember the conductor was sitting across from me. His name was Lieber Mathauser, and he was a big conductor in Czechoslovakia. And I looked around, and here were American Continentals. There were Dutch bus drivers. There was a Czechoslovakian choir, and there were Germans, East Germans, the Christians that had been there with us. And someone started singing a tune. This is sort of like what you had talked about, Danette. And someone started singing a tune in Czechoslovakian, and it was a Continental song. So then all of our guys started singing, and then the Dutch guys sang it in Dutch, and then the German guys sang it. So here we were singing this Continental song in 4 different languages. And then we kept singing all these songs. And then afterwards they said, let's gather together for prayer. So we all held hands. We were in this gigantic circle. And we have since then dubbed it Czechoslovakian prayer time. And what they did was a person would say, Lord, thank you for this great time tonight. Amen. And then everybody would say, Amen, with this great enthusiasm. And then somebody would pray in English and then say, Amen. And everyone would say, Amen. And here was this in German, in English, in Czechoslovakian, and in Dutch. These one-sentence prayers that were followed by Amen, and then everybody said Amen. Afterwards, they said, okay, you guys have to go. And so in sort of hushed tones, he said, Bob, I need 2 girls. And 2 girls. Boom. And they disappeared. And he goes, I need 3 guys. And I go, 1, 2, 3, like that. Boom. And they disappeared. And all of a sudden, here were all these Continentals that were gone. And I realized I have absolutely no idea where they're going. And so the next morning, we met back at the church, and we heard these great stories about, we walked about 4 blocks that way, and then we went through an alleyway, and then we came through a back door and up the stairs, and we went across the street this way, and then we took a taxi down here, and then we took a train car back this way, just in case they had been followed, that they would hopefully lose anybody that might have been trailing them. So we got back to the church, got on the bus, and went back to the campground to dismantle all of these tents. And sure enough, there was our East German tour guide waiting for us. And boy, was he mad. He was spitting bullets, man. He was furious. So, where have you been? And I said, I don't know. So, where'd you guys stay last night? And I said, I don't know. Some people just came and took us home, and I need to have every single name that you stayed with. And I said, I'm sorry, we don't know who they were. And he goes, do you realize who has been looking for you all night long? And I said, no. And he goes, well, we've had the East German police, the secret police, the Russian this and the Russian that, and they've been looking for you guys all night long, wanting to find out where you're at. And he goes, I need to have the names of every single family that you stayed with. So I went back to the Continentals and I said, do not give this guy any information. You can't, because these people's lives are in danger if we share. There was a young man from Martin Luther convent, what they called it, and he was the young man that set up the whole tour. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name, but he was there with us. And after we got all the tents back on the bus, he sat on the bus and he was very quiet. And by this point, the Dutch bus driver's Tom Komstra was there, and he was working with our East German tour guide. And the East German host, this young man, came and sat on the bus, and he was very, very quiet. He was very thoughtful. All of a sudden, he stood up and he says, Bob, I have to go. And he got off the bus and he started walking down a road. 60 seconds later, this East German tour guide came and got on the bus. And had he been on the bus, I'm sure his life would have been in danger for hosting us. And so now the East German tour guide is touring and taking us to see all these cathedrals. And I had told the Continentals, do not give him any information, no matter what you do. And so he kept prying with all of our kids, trying to get them to who you with last night? Who'd you stay with last night? And they were evasive. And so we went back and we saw all the same castles that we had seen the day before. And he finally kept pumping and nothing. So he says, you realize that I can keep you here indefinitely, right? I said, I understand that. And so we started heading towards the border, and he says, you can let me out right here. And he said, I'm a trumpet player too. Oh. And I said, that's very nice. And he just gave me that look, and I think at that moment he knew. He must have had an inkling about who we were. And my heart really, really bled, because I thought, here we are on 2 sides of this gigantic wall, 2 trumpet players that probably could have sat down, had a cup of coffee, and he might have just wanted, what's it like to be a musician in America? What's it like to have that kind of freedom? And he says, yes, I play trumpet in all these cathedrals around us. Oh, that's very, very nice. And he got off the bus, and he turned around and he looked at me, and my heart just sunk, and I thought, I just couldn't have tipped our hand and said who we were because it was too dangerous. So as we pulled out, on the road came a whole convoy of German police, army, and everybody, the same people that had been looking for us all night long. And we just kept going. And the whole time I thought, we could be stuck here. We got to the border, they checked our passports, and we pulled out. And I thought, through that whole experience, either A, I was very ignorant, or I was just too stupid to realize the danger that we were in, or more likely than not, that God's hand of protection had been on us those entire 48 hours and had seen us through that. Because I never really felt the stress or the pressure. I was never scared. It was just that peace of God that surpasses all understanding, that he was in control of that entire thing. And there's no telling what impact we had on that Czechoslovakian choir, or on those East German people that were there, or on the Dutch bus drivers, or even on that one East German border guard. Come to find out, his daughter had broken her leg the day before we got there, and that's why he did not meet us at the border. And you thought, how tragic that may have been, but that might have been God's perfect way of providing for us the freedom to go and do those concerts the way that he wanted us to do.
If we could just pull the frame way back and look at the Continental experience from God's perspective, I think we would be overwhelmed by the way God spared the Continentals for decades, and still does to this day. From bus accidents to, illegal situations behind the Iron Curtain, it really is amazing. And I think that is what made us who we were as Continentals, was realizing we were stepping into the unknown and situations that were maybe at risk. As a result, prayer really mattered. Do you remember the prayer times before the concerts?
Yes.
We knew just enough to know that, this probably isn't real smart, that what we're doing here right now, but God's with us. And our prayers were always very, very specific, and we actually saw miracles. We prayed and God delivered. But I think back at some of the best times. One was in South Africa, just outside of Johannesburg in Soweto, which is probably one of the poorest regions of South Africa. And we were able to do a concert there, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people who came to that concert and showed up hours before in anticipation of the American group coming to their town. But this is what I learned as we would sing songs about Jesus and the joy that he brought to our lives. Remember all those times where you thought, they're the ones ministering to us right now because of the joy in the Lord that they have. And then I think about 1980. Jim, you were on that tour where we were set to go to Russia for the Olympics. And the U.S. boycotted that year. And I know we were scrambling at the 11th hour to figure out, well, we're not going to Russia, so now what? And we ended up staying in Eastern Europe, behind the Iron Curtain. It was risky. We've got some harrowing stories about the Russian train and, just so many ways that God spared us through that journey. But the thing that stands out to me most were going into Poland as students studying abroad, yet with a very creative, innovative host named Andrew Baginski, who was able to set up concerts in the Catholic churches. And how the word traveled, I don't know, but the word traveled and people showed up, and those cathedrals were filled with people. And this is where I learned about the power of the gospel. Even though they were Catholics, they knew of Jesus. Every concert would wrap with just a brief presentation of the good news, the gospel. And something about good music that just tenderizes the heart and gets people, emotional enough to really amplify the gospel. And do you remember in those cathedrals, you would give the invitation, and if you want to receive Jesus for the first time, just raise your hand. Everybody in the cathedral would raise their hands. You're just like, really? But apparently, they had never heard the gospel the way we presented it, with the music and just a clear presentation of who Jesus is. I'll never forget that. And, we stopped counting. who knows, thousands. But talk about the ripple effect. I know people came to faith in Jesus and understood what the true gospel message was. And I believe that Continental's impact going into some of these countries behind the Iron Curtain and all over the world in unexpected places was a seed for the church, and that the church grew as a result of it. The Romanian Continentals today is the most thriving international group, and remember the days in Romania where we couldn't even go in.
I know. It's fresh on my mind now because I'm going there in about 5 weeks, as I told you guys, with Cam, for the 20th anniversary of the Romanian Continentals ministry. But it's most remarkable for me because I directed the first Continental group ever to visit Romania in 1984. And it was during all the same kinds of things you're talking about, Bob, and the guides that we had who tried to prevent us from engaging with people, certainly from going to churches and so forth. And there's a zillion stories there. But I remember being in the Romanian churches where they would say, we had somebody on our team in country who was working to set these up and connect us with the pastors, and we were just visiting, and that we weren't there to perform. We couldn't perform, but when the pastor recognized me as the director of the group, I could give a greeting.
Yeah, that's right.
And the definition of greeting is very, very broad, we found out. And greeting for us, because we were traveling, students, some of whom we needed to practice our instruments for the 3 weeks we were there, just happened to have those when we were visiting and giving our greeting in church. I would turn around and give them a note, and we'd start singing. The brass would come up, the guitarist would play, and we'd do 3 or 4 or 5 songs in these churches. And they would, they'd be weeping, and it was just really, really powerful. And I think that's one of the things that comes to my mind when you talk about all these millions of experiences, is a leadership principle that I learned from Cam, which is if God's not in it, you can't start it. If God is in it, you can't stop it. And I think that attitude comes really to fruition when we make ourselves available, when we go to the uncomfortable place, when we get in a dangerous situation, where we go where most people wouldn't go, in Kingston, Jamaica, or whatever. When you go out there and you make yourself available, God does really amazing things. And the stories are, for all of us, are just too many. I have one like that in the Moscow Baptist Church where they were oppressed. We gave a greeting, and after we sang, they weren't allowed to applaud because the rules were so strict there, but they went, collectively as an audience. And it was, I'll never forget it. I mean, it's very moving for me still. Or in Tonga, the islands in the South Pacific, we performed for the King of Tonga, who's a devout Christian man, and performed at the palace. We had to be barefooted. They opened these sliding doors. There he was, a very large man, about 450 pounds, very tall, about 6'7", sitting on his throne, and he was where the tripod is there. And so we sang, and I approached him, handed him something, and who does that? Who gets to engage with the king of a country? And so, or in Dakar, Senegal, in '85, my car crew was one of my assistants on that tour. Incredible experience in West Africa, in a mosque for about 2,000 Muslim people who absolutely welcomed and we shared our testimony. This wasn't just music and that they didn't understand. We shared our testimony through qualified interpreters. And when you make yourself available, you never know where God's going to lead you. And that to me is one of the really exciting things about this ministry and just the shared experience that we have with tens of thousands of other former Continentals.
Cam understood that the calling was real and that God was with us, and he wasn't afraid. He never let out of fear. He always let out of faith and confidence in the leaders that he would pluck out of nowhere, and they would set us up to win. I mean, remember our director's manuals where we would go to director's camp and prepare, but no one could plan in detail what we were facing.
About it, I was not ever a director, and yet I had to put my delicate little self in your hands, and no worries. I had so much confidence in our leaders at that point. I believe that Cam, his leadership, putting us in situations that were so uncomfortable and so unusual, at risk, and he made it was his way of thinking. He always thought about that. You know where we're going to go? We're going to go do this. And you know what? Next year we're going to add this group, and next year we're going to have this many groups, and then after that we're going to go here. It was always the next thing that needed to happen, and it was very much Spirit-led for him. We all put our confidence in his ability to lead us and direct us, and that's why in all of those years of all of our collective experiences, we're still here. We still have that, and I'm not afraid. There's a lot of times when I'm in situations where I go, you should be afraid. I'm not. I've been in too many of those to know that God's in charge and not me.
Yeah.
I remember that we were going into communist Yugoslavia in '79, and there was this real thing that they did not want Bibles in anywhere. And we had been at the base in Lausanne, Switzerland, the YWAM base, where they were working with Brother Andrew to get 1 million Bibles into the Olympics. But it was a real tense time. And I remember that we not only had our own Bibles going into Yugoslavia, but we also had extras to give out. And boy, the guys with the machine guns came on the bus at the border. I mean, I don't know how many of us saw machine guns for the first time, but that was my first time. And there was one that stood at the front and then one that went, and he opened every bag, and we had Bibles in there. And I don't know, he didn't see the Bibles. But then we had to stop on this tour because one of our girls unfortunately had a reaction to asthma medication, and so we were stuck in this neighborhood. And I said to one of the other guys, why don't we just go through this neighborhood and knock on doors and see if we can tell people about Jesus? And that was that blissful innocence, right? So we knocked on the door and started talking to this guy, and he invited us in.
Which country was this?
Yugoslavia.
Okay.
And he invited us in, and we sat down, and I had my Bible, and I said, do you happen to have a Bible? And he said, yeah, I have a Bible. And of course, you know, it was in a language I didn't understand and stuff, but I could see by the headings and the numbers what the verses were, so I went through and marked verses for him in his Bible and so forth, and I think I asked him if we could pray together, and he was very, very receptive. We were done, and he said, do you know why I have that Bible? And I said, no. He said, it's because I'm a lawyer for the Communist Party, and I have that Bible only for the fact of disproving it.
Oh, my goodness.
He said, but you've changed my heart today. Wow. And he said, you've really caused me to think. Then we got back on the bus, and we were off. It was an unscheduled stop. But because the Bibles were blind to these guys at the border, I had my Bible, and it was just, you know, things like that. You know, that wasn't a planned event. It wasn't a concert. It wasn't anything. But, you know, I think that taught me, as it teaches every Continental, that we have the ability to be bold in our faith and to share, and that God went before me there and tenderized his heart somehow, not with music, but something else.
2 questions. One is, what's the biggest takeaway for you of your Continental experience? I am thankful for blank from my Continental experience. Sum it up, Danette.
I think I'm probably the most thankful for the fact that I get to share and get to be a Continental. The experiences that we've had, all of us collectively, are, like you say, overwhelming. You can't put a quantitative thing on that. It just is. And I think the fact that I got to be a Continental my whole life is awesome because I got to share Jesus in a way that other people didn't.
Bob?
There's no doubt that our lives have been tremendously impacted by what we did with Continentals, that we would not be who we are today had it not been for the Continental experience. There's just no doubt about that. The leadership qualities that were developed during that time, the ability to problem solve. You know, how many times did you face something on tour that it wasn't what you expected, and yet you had to find a solution? The friendships that have lifelong friendships that have been developed and maintained. It's just an amazing experience, and I'm truly thankful for the privilege of being part of that ministry for so many years.
You know, I am so thankful that God allowed me to see the things that I saw at that time in my life that really helped shape me. But I would agree with Bob. Lifelong friendships, people that have experienced those things together, there is a bond there that can't be broken. And even though you haven't seen someone in 20 years, when you have that shared experience, there is a bond there. It's like you never missed a day. Terry and I will be in Orlando in March, and we're visiting one of our friends from Continentals in 1980. And we see each other maybe every 4 or 5 years, but it's just, there's something about those friendships. Having a group of people that will support you in prayer, or if something's going on with your family, those are people that you can count on. And so I'm just grateful and so thankful that I really was allowed to be a part of such a wonderful organization. Yeah.
You said one thing. I have to go with more than one, but I have to start with I'm probably most grateful that I met my wife, Krista Miller, in 1977. Married almost 40 years. This November, I think a lot of people have that testimony. There were a lot of people that connected through Continentals and married, so grateful for that. The other thing, I think I would have never had a laboratory to experiment with life and becoming who, the man that God designed me to be. I would have never had a better laboratory than Continentals to experiment and discover. And out of that opportunity to be a director, a leader, I developed that sense of grit and that confidence and that entrepreneurial spirit that nothing can stop me, because God's with me and He's created me for this. And I'm so grateful for that. Like I said earlier, I could have paid for the most, the best education, traditional education on the planet, and still not benefited the way I did from my Continental days.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, the Continental experience was like opening the iris, like on a camera lens, to the world. And I don't mean just seeing the world, I mean seeing what God could do through me and through people I love in the world. Mm-hmm. And to see the world in a different way. And so, and I really feel that now as I went to Chile last March, and now I'm going to Romania, and if I'm with people in Holland or Korea, they all see it the same way too because of the shared experience that we have. And so that's a really unique thing. I'm really grateful for that, I guess, sort of continental worldview that really opened up the world.
Do you think the other directors are experiencing what we experienced back in the day?
Absolutely. I know that they are. I mean, Josef in Romania and Vilar in Brazil. And I mean, Vilar started a continental group in Brazil, and they're amazing. It's like Cirque du Soleil. I mean, dance and orchestra, and it's incredible stuff. But he just went recently and worked with the Korean Continentals to do ministry in Singapore over the Christmas season. That's like, that's cool. Like, why? How can he do that? They pulled it together via email and knew exactly what to do because of their
So the
their shared
international
experience.
groups are connected?
Oh, yeah.
Just through technology?
Yeah,
and
some
virtual-
more than others, and technology, and they're all liking and commenting on each other's posts on Facebook. I mean, it's really an amazing
Do they
thing.
share common music at this point?
They do, especially, in the language groups, the Latin Continentals are our oldest Spanish-speaking group, and so they feed the Costa Rican, Mexican, and Chilean groups, and it's really cool. The cross-pollination is really cool.
I just think, as a group of us sitting here, did we ever think that there would be other international groups going on as a result of what we were doing the very first time we did it? And I can honestly say no. I did not think that we would be that expansive, that Continentals would go to all the world and become a ministry for all the world. Mm. I felt like we would go to the world and do, preach the gospel, but I never saw what God was going to be able to do through that. And I think it's just that, I think that's the best.
That is the ripple effect.
Very much.
Final question. Which of my solos on Continental Records is your favorite? No. If you were stranded on a desert island and you could only take one recording and it had to be a Continental program, Continental album, which one would it be?
Oh, Continental Country, of course.
Sorry, Cam. Which one?
Don't look at me first. Our recordings were sing.
Those were on 8 tracks. Yeah.
I would take Wings of Light. Because
The first one?
the very first one.
Because Fred paid you to say that.
No, because I was a huge Seawind fan
That's right.
in early days, and the combination of the brass, which I love, and the harmonies, that just fits my vibe. So that's what I would take.
Was
Robert?
86 all over the world? I think it'd been my favorite.
Wow.
And it may have been that we had talked about that earlier, is that particular group was off the charts musically. And that was, I thought it was a really solid program, and the band and the choir really sang. It was sort of like playing your favorite CD every single night as you stood up there. And so maybe that's why I'm a little bit partial, and I think it was, we were there for Amsterdam 86 with the Billy Graham Crusade,
right.
and we were performing every night. And so I think there was something special about that particular summer.
Partnered with the Jesus film that year as well,
Yeah.
all around the world, in Africa especially.
I think I'd take my own playlist because honestly, I don't have a favorite, but I have favorite songs.
If I had to choose one, it'd be pure nostalgia, and it would have to be Majesty and Glory.
77.
77. That was, to me, I was just a Continental singer. I was not a director, anything. I was just, that was the tour that I remember the most. And that's therefore the record I remember the most.
Continental Freeze.
Well, that was every year, wasn't it?
We had to.
What was that about anyway? Entertainment, right?
Exactly. For me, I associate so many with all the records. I mean, I sang on them from 81 to the very last one, but so they're all special in that regard. 86, all over the world, was a blast. But for me, I think it was Together We Will Stand, 85, and the whole partnership with World Vision, and that was the year we raised about $2.5 million for World Vision and for famine relief in Africa through World Vision. And
Scott Wesley Brown was a part of that too, right?
yes, we went to West Africa together and did the planning trip for that, and yeah, that was a really powerful year. So it's been a total blast to have you guys here. Honestly, it's been a dream of mine for years, to talk about the things that make the Continental experience unique and the impact that it has. And so I love you guys.
And thank you
here.
for all you do to keep perpetuating this. I mean,
It's my privilege.
I hope that people can begin to understand what that ripple effect really is and what's happening with Continentals around the world.
Yeah.
It really is remarkable.
Yeah, the same thing that happened with all of us is happening literally today in these other countries. It's remarkable. So thanks for being here, and thanks for joining us for Continental Leadership Roundtables.
We have the master's promise. He said